So if you look at the number of women who end up practicing as legal practitioners, very low in comparison to that of men. If we look at the type of work that is given to women, sometimes work that won't develop women in the same way that men are developed, because men have traditionally kind of been trusted with the hard law more. And there are exceptions. I'm not saying that this is what's happening everywhere across the board, but I can also speak about this from personal experience, that certain areas of the law, the softer areas of the law, are seen to be more appropriate for women. And this means that you're not given the kind of opportunity in the same way to develop and grow. And, for example, become ripe for appointment to the bench. Those experiences really matter. When women choose to have children, how they fall off the ladder and aren't able to progress to, for example, becoming directors or seniors in law firms. Let's not even talk about the Bar Council. The bar has traditionally been known and continues to be in many ways an old boys club.
Cherith, thank you for taking the time to talk to me about women in the legal profession. We celebrate 100 years of women in law this year in South Africa. We came a long way, and today I want us to reflect on your journey as a woman in the legal profession. So let's start at the beginning. Please tell us a bit about yourself.
So firstly, thank you for having me be part of this series of podcasts. I'm very happy to be part of it. I'm Cherith Sanger. I am an attorney, a non-practicing attorney presently. My focus for many years has been on gender and the law, and a little bit broader than that as well in terms of human rights. I'm presently a lecturer in the Department of Criminal Justice and Procedure, teaching and supervising students and engaging in community engagement in the area of gender and the law. Yes, where am I from originally? I grew up in Mitchell's Plain in Portland. I was born there. I lived there for 23 years until I was in my second year of articles. And that's when I only moved out of Mitchell's Plain. I come from a family with a political consciousness, and I think that is where my human rights orientation or my social justice orientation came from. My sister, Dr. Nadia Sanger, her work was on gender long before I started working on gender in any way. So I think the foundation for focusing on women's rights very much came from my home. And later on, of course, when I joined non-profit organizations and governmental organizations working in the area of women's rights. So that's very broadly been my trajectory.
Okay. The one thing that I saw from your journey so far is that you early on choose law. So you have a LLB from UWC, as you mentioned, but you also have a LLM from UCLA. Why did you choose a career in law?
So when I was a child, I actually already knew that I wanted to be a lawyer. You know, when my parents kind of asked me what I wanted to do, I said I wanted to be a lawyer. I'm not sure exactly why, but I was very young. I was probably at primary school. But along the way, as I grew up and became a teenager, there was a time I wanted to study fine arts. And when I got closer to matric, I think I'd applied to study arts at UCT and then also law at UWC, but first UCT for arts. And I had a discussion with my late father, and he said the realities are, as a person of color and a woman of color, fine arts may be difficult for you to live a decent life. And I went back to my original idea of becoming a lawyer, and then I started studying law here at UWC in 2001 was my first year of my LLB. And I loved studying law. I think I was lucky enough to have chosen something that I was really interested in. And of course, in your final year of study in the LLB, you are able to start choosing the kinds of subjects that really interest you. And that is where I did modules in areas of human rights, juvenile justice, SA Bill of Rights, and definitely some modules in gender law, I imagine. It's a long time ago now, but yes, that's where I started choosing the kind of area I was interested in. After that, however, I got articles at one of the big 5 law firms, which was then called Decriminalization, which was not a human rights law firm in any way. There was definitely a social responsibility focus, and I became interested in that while I was doing my articles, and I worked there as an associate attorney for 1 year. But my passion for human rights came back again, and that is when I then moved over into NGOs, where I did very focused work on gender. And my particular interest in gender-based violence really developed there. And then later on, there was an opportunity for me to do an LLM at UCLA through a fellowship with Sonke Gender Justice. And what was very interesting and attractive about the opportunity was that UCLA Law School offers a specialized LLM in the area of public interest law and policy, PULP, which allowed me to focus and really learn much more about public interest law within the areas of gender health and human rights. So that kind of just added on to my interest, because I had already been working in NGOs before that. So it could deepen my knowledge base. And it was also very useful to be studying with students from all over the world, because I got to learn about different advocacy approaches, for example, different litigation approaches, and just issues outside of just South Africa. And that's also where you learn that there's very similar issues. Of course, the contexts differ because of in South Africa, our recent history of apartheid, our history of colonization, and of course, in terms of where we are at, because every context is different, but there are similar factors. So that was very useful. And when I returned with the LLM, I then worked at Sonke Gender Justice for a while as the policy development and advocacy manager. That was at that stage. So I worked there for a while, then I consulted on projects, human rights and gender projects with NGOs, and I also did some private practice work, mainly in the area of family law, and then some commercial work, but commercial work has never been my main area. I know nothing about commercial work. And yes, I then joined SWET, which is the Sex Workers Education and Advocacy Task Force. And at one time, I was the manager of the Human Rights Defense, Advocacy and Human Rights Defense program. And that is where my interest in sex work, or specifically looking at the intersections between sex work, gender, and that kind of thing really developed. So my doctoral topic is presently, I'm doing a feminist legal analysis of the corrupt policing of sex work. So that's kind of for me where everything came together. The point, sex workers are probably one of the most marginalized groups or categories of people in South Africa. So, and they often experience intersectional discrimination and oppression, not only because it's primarily women who work as sex workers, but also because often these women are poor, often these women are black. The vast majority of sex workers are black, poor women. There are, of course, also transgender sex workers and a smaller population of male sex workers, men who work as sex workers. But the reality is there's an acute vulnerability to oppression, and particularly an acute vulnerability to violence. So gender-based violence is a very particular issue when it comes to sex workers. So I think that is where my interest in really learning more about the issues and how we can use the law and policy to improve sex workers' daily realities. So that is very much a focus of my work. I still do gender-based violence work to some extent outside of sex work, but actually you cannot divorce the two issues at all.
Okay, so let's go into women's rights. And clearly from your explanation so far is that you have a passion for women's rights. So where does this come from?
So I think that growing up in a home, so there were I grew up with lots of discussions about, human rights in terms of anti-racism, because growing up, obviously, apartheid was still in place before 1993, before the shifts came in. But even after that, there was a lot of dialogue in the house constantly. My father's side of the family, there was always lots of dialogue happening around anti-racism and that kind of thing. And also there were discussions about gender and women's rights and equality. And there was a sense of growing up where my sister and I were never ever indirectly or directly told, it was never enforced that there's anything that we cannot do. We grew up very freely and were able to make decisions or anything that we wanted to do, that even if it was considered to be traditional male kind of roles or occupations or whatever it would be, there were never limitations on that. So I think certainly there was some of the foundation came from there. But then when my sister started focusing on gender studies, I was also learning a lot more about gender from her, not in terms of the law because she's a social scientist, but that foundation was laid there. And definitely when I started working at the Women's Legal Center, where there was really a focus on women's human rights, the Women's Legal Center was opened, particularly in terms of advancing women's rights and in terms of developing and changing the law to advance women's rights. In the 90s, after our Constitution, specifically in Section 9, included the right to equality on the grounds of gender and sex, and many other grounds that are relevant to gender, many of them. But the point is that this is where the center was open to kind of start developing the law, where we could actually have the courts deliver judgments that, added the kind of meat to the bones in terms of what do these rights really mean for women. And moving to the Women's Legal Center for me, most of my learning around women and the law and women's rights and the law actually happened there. So my interest just deepened as I learned more, and I was working with other women, people who were more experienced than me, who were lawyers doing work in terms of gender-based violence, in terms of women's sexual reproductive health and rights, in terms of land and housing, in terms of marriage and relationship rights. This is kind of the focus area of the Women's Legal Center, the focus areas. So that is where I really learned more and my interest developed. And it's just an area that is now part of who I am, which is the kind of work I'd always do. And sex work is, of course, part of women's rights work more broadly.
Yeah. So before I go into there's a question I have with regards to teaching. But there's this one question that I was supposed to put on here, but it slipped my mind. Now that you talk about the Constitution and how most of the sections is applicable to gender, but Section 9 really speaks to gender and gender equality. One of the saddest things that happened in South Africa is the judgment, the Iron Grootboom case.
Grootboom.
Iron Grootboom.
Yes. Yeah.
Jan Kruimfontein, I don't know if you...
The land case, the housing case.
The housing case.
That case was taken to court by the Women's Legal Center. I wasn't involved with it, but Grootboom is one of the biggest kind of classic cases in the area of women's rights in terms of housing.
But the one thing that struck me is the failure. Is that the Constitution triumphed and the law triumphed in that particular instance in the judgment, but then you get back to the delivery and the limitation that's on it.
Yeah.
In reasonable means, you have to provide these particular rights. So when it comes to women's rights, because Irene Grootboom was a woman who died in a shack,
poor,
poor, in a shack without housing, even though the court ruled in their favor. What do you think about that limitation in the Constitution?
The Grootboom case and what happened to Irene Grootboom is one of the examples of the failure to implement a constitution which is for the most part very progressive. The reality is lots of the rights in the Constitution are still very paper-bound, and that there are several issues that impact the implementation of the Constitution. So in other words, making the Constitution real for people to improve people's daily realities and daily lives. Grootboom is specifically around housing issues, but we see the same issues. So we know that in South Africa that we lead the world in terms of our gender-based violence statistics. We have high levels of domestic violence, high levels of sexual violence. So for women, South Africa, in fact, is one of the most dangerous countries to live in. Very, very high statistics. Some research conducted by the Medical Research Council, probably I'd say a number of years ago, but one of the biggest studies indicated that 25% of men had raped a woman in their lifetime or in the last year, the year preceding that study. We also know that there's other statistics that talk about 1 in 3 to 1 in 5 women experiencing domestic violence in their lifetimes. There's lots of stats about this. There were also, there's so many. The point is the studies conducted on the prevalence of GBV undoubtedly indicate that women live in danger every day. Their intimate partners in particular, intimate partner violence as domestic violence, which is a terminology we commonly use here. There's a Domestic Violence Act as well, which also has been amended, which is also meant to improve women's realities in terms of accessing a remedy or protection. So it's both about preventing and then providing a remedy. But the reality is women are still continue to experience domestic violence at very high levels. So what are the issues with implementation? There are several issues with implementation. For example, the role players in the criminal justice system who are meant to be applying the Constitution or implementing it, are they doing so? Not in all respects. The implementation is uneven, let me put it that way. I cannot say that there's no implementation at all. There are some success stories, but the reality is that there are also many which are not success stories. There's also an issue of the kind of mindsets or thinking of the role players in the criminal justice system. Is there the will? So women still can, today, in 2023, approach the police station for assistance in a domestic violence matter, and the police would still not sometimes know what their responsibilities are in terms of legislation and policy. And they know they are not fulfilling it, or sometimes if they know there's an unwillingness to do so, because there is a mentality still today of shying away of what is considered to be a domestic matter. The point is it's a violation of rights. There's also this huge gap between the Constitution and what it says, and then South Africans, people, in terms of, is there really a kind of full understanding of the importance and meaning of those rights? And then we've got to ask ourselves a question also of, look at the realities of people in South Africa. We still have high levels of poverty, high levels of unemployment, real issues. And so we're talking human rights, but some of these basic kind of socioeconomic rights or entitlements or basic human needs are not being fulfilled. Our people are being failed in so many ways in South Africa. So the difficulty in that these are the realities on the ground and in real life that people experience, and then we're talking about these kinds of rights. I mean, if we talk about violence in communities and we look at some of the causes of violence, and I mean, there's many of them, issues about men not being, the social expectation of men being required to provide for families. When you're living in, look at today, a recession, and also a situation with high levels of unemployment, historically not having access to education. So besides just low earning capacity in itself, just also some people generally not working, and then men feeling emasculated and using violence against women in all forms. It doesn't only need to be physical, and that's what's good about our legislation around domestic violence, emotional, psychological, economic violence, etc., all forms of violence. But the point is that men feeling emasculated and using violence against women to assert power and control is often something that is very common. So, there's a multitude of reasons for why, and it's all about gender inequality in many ways, and these are all manifestations of it, because patriarchy is still alive and well in South Africa and beyond South Africa. So in all these various manifestations, often women are the ones on the receiving end of it. Don't get me wrong, and it's always important for me to say this, that I'm not saying that men are not experiencing violence or that men don't occupy in the social hierarchy or lower ends of the social hierarchy. Male-on-male violence is also a very real issue. And then again, we need to think about why is the theme, so violence against women, when men use violence against women, but men using violence against other men as well. Where does this come from? We live in one of the most violent societies, and I think there are links between how violence was used against Black people and people of color in South Africa during apartheid and starting before that in terms of colonial rule, how we were taught violence. And I think that when you are dehumanized and where you are not treated with dignity, which we are all meant to be entitled to, way before a constitution, human rights are natural rights, and it's not about having named it when we had a constitution or the development of international human rights in treaties and conventions and that kind of thing on the UN level or on the international or regional level. Beyond that, I think that when you are not treated with dignity as a human being, and dignity is something that's innate, and if you're not treated with dignity and respect, and violence is used against you in all forms, it didn't need to be physical, but which it was, of course, in apartheid and under colonial rule, the reality is that people are taught violence and are taught that this is the way to control people, because that is, and it becomes part of your DNA in a sense. And what also happens is that kind of the use of power in all these various ways, including through violence, is then handed down. It's intergenerational in many ways. And we know this because research tells us about how children who witness domestic violence in the household, boy children in particular, are then raised to use violence against women when they become men. And similarly, women become accustomed to men using violence against them. So, yeah, it's complicated, but the intergenerational nature of violence is something that's real, and that comes from our history in terms of what's been handed down, what becomes part of our DNA, and how that cycle then continues. And how do we break the cycle? Are we doing enough in South Africa? Is the state doing enough? Is social development doing enough? All these things are linked. It's not just about going to Mitchell's Plain, or it's not just about going to Khayelitsha and rolling out a program to talk about violence and why you shouldn't use violence. It's much bigger than that. One program is not going to fix a problem. It needs to be long-term and consistent. It's also, as part of that, about putting people in the position to really start about unlearning violent behavior by giving people the basic necessities that they need to survive. So I think these things are all linked. There's no clear-cut answer. It's very complex. There's not one way of looking at it. There's many things that I'm not even speaking about now that form part of the bigger issue, and, kind of things that you learn in your journey of working in a particular area. But women's vulnerability to violence is a very real issue. Men's vulnerability is also a real issue because of the violent and crime-ridden society that we live in. But when it comes to gender and the particular power relations between men and women, patriarchy has a major role to play, and often, women are on the losing end of it in many ways. So I'm not saying that there's not an hierarchy or power dynamics that impact men negatively in the social hierarchy that we have in this. The reality is just that when women are involved, there is still gender inequality, and often women are at the losing end of it in many ways.
Shira, thank you for that explanation that it's complex. And I agree with you on every point that you just outlined. Definitely, we can trace it back to a very violent historical dispensation that slowly molded very violent intergenerational pain. So each generation, there is still a lot of pain that is experienced. For example, because there's so much intergenerational pain in my family, many of my cousins, brothers are addicted to hardcore drugs, and two of my brothers have seen the inside of prison. So I know exactly. I know that my grandfather was a very violent person, um, and because of his violence, that was transferred to his kids. Um, but there is some people who break the cycle and try to break from
Like
that
yourself.
specific. Yeah, like myself, but I will never give myself the credit. I'll give my grandmother the credit, because despite all of the structural violence and the pain and the hurt that was caused her, she decided to love, and she decided to love hard. And because she loved hard, I think most of her grandkids and even her children experience love. So there is, when you love even the unlovable, that's when the healing starts taking place. And I don't think the prison system and our current system is loving people enough. But we need to move on. And what I would like us to talk about is, you also get into lecturing and research. So how did you get into lecturing and teaching?
So I think that I knew that I wanted to teach law eventually. When I was working in NGOs, I did a lot of training and capacity building, lots of workshops, but obviously, working with a smaller group of people. But I knew I wanted to explore doctoral study. And when positions became available at UWC, I applied for them, and I was lucky enough to get one. as a lecturer in criminal justice and procedure. And criminal justice and procedure, there's always going to be intersections with gender and marginalized groups. So there's a link between criminal justice and human rights, a huge link and a very important one. So for me, they go hand in hand. So when I'm doing work around advocating for the decriminalization of sex work, there's a direct link that you can make between how sex work is criminalized in South Africa, and a lot of the advocacy that I do is linked to sex workers' human rights. So looking at those two and the impact of criminalization on sex workers' lived realities and the impact, of course, on the human rights. So I'm just trying to explain a bit of a link. But I wanted to explore a PhD study, and I wanted to teach. I felt ready for that. And it's been an amazing experience, coming back. There is an incredible sense of safety, security, and belonging at UWC in the law faculty, especially if you've studied there. So coming back here, it was a decision I made and something that I did want to do for a while. It's not always easy to get into academia, especially nowadays to get a full-time post. So the time was right then. It wasn't also entirely easy starting a new job with I think my child was 14 weeks. So that was also quite a challenge, starting a new job and with a small baby. But as women, these are the things we need to do. We need to work, we need to survive. And it's also very difficult when you leave your career, when you decide to have a child, because you kind of fall off that ladder and you need to kind of, in a way, start all over again. And I was consulting, so I was working for myself prior to coming to UWC. You need to think, there's lots of decisions you need to make when you choose to have a serious career, if I can call it that, a serious career, and, make the decision to have a child, and starting a PhD and a new teaching job. It's a lot to take on. And it's not always easy, but the point is women have done it before, and it's a choice for me, and it's part of my journey and my development as a woman, as a human, and as a professional and as an academic. So I'm not an academic for very long. It's since 2018, September, I started. And of course, there was COVID hit us as well. And if I talk about COVID, and how the GBV stats increased during COVID, how the domestic violence increased, with families being forced in closed spaces for extended periods of time, with their not being able to work, people not earning money, poor access to food, etc., etc. But yeah, the point is that it's an incredible experience being able to work with young people at this time in particular. There is a culture of wokeness that exists among students that never existed in the same way when I was a student in 2001. So that's incredible. Things have shifted, things have changed over the 20 years I was gone. I don't even know how long it is. But the point is that there's something incredible about working with young people, something incredible about sharing with young people, teaching them about what the law is, how the law works. And for me, what was interesting, and I worked for many years, obviously, before I came here, from about 2000 and, I can't remember the dates anymore, 2005 to 2018, my experiences in terms of, working in a law firm and then in legal NGOs, doing litigation, advocacy, legal advice, etc., has been very important for me and good for me, so that when I'm in a classroom, I can also teach about my own experiences. I think that there are some modules that can be taught completely theoretically, but in our department in criminal justice and procedure, most of us come from practice. And it's useful when you're teaching criminal law to be able to talk about your work around, for example, the Criminal Law Sexual Offences Related Matters Amendment Act, the amendment of 2007. Why were those amendments important? Because I had some involvement, with the work around that. It's useful for me to be able to share those experiences and my understanding of it, and, being able to say that I've consulted real women who were GBV survivors. It's very important. It helps a lot in terms of enriching the experience and basically bringing real life into the classroom for students. So I think that's been useful, and I'm glad that I can share it. I've still got much more to learn, but I can share what I've learned thus far.
Let's talk about the decriminalization of sex work, because that's also an area that you're specializing in, and your ongoing research is there. So you authored a guide called the Sex Worker Labor Law Guide, a guide to your rights. How did this come about?
So the Sex Worker Labor Law Guide was a guide that I drafted as a consultant for the Sex Workers Education and Advocacy Task Force. After I'd worked there, I continued working on projects with them, and this was one of the guides, or one of the projects. So it was a guide that was specifically aimed for the target audience was for sex workers. So that, it's about not only doing the work for sex workers to advance sex workers' rights, but also getting sex workers involved in the process so that they can fight for their own rights, so that they become actual agents for improving their own realities or for change themselves. And that's a very important approach to the work, the nothing about us without us, which actually this whole concept developed from the HIV sector. But in other areas involving other marginalized groups, it's become something quite prominent, specifically with sex workers. It's very important. It's about also sex workers being empowered to work themselves, not only people like myself, who's never worked as sex workers, who don't fully really understand the realities of being a sex worker, the hardships that comes with it, working as a sex worker in a country where it's criminalized, and all the other grounds or other intersecting grounds of discrimination and oppression that you experience as a sex worker, because you are a woman, because you are poor, because you are black, because you may be HIV positive, etc. So this is the beauty of working at a place like Sweat, or with a place like Sweat, an organization where you actually have sex workers in the building on a daily basis doing the work themselves as well. And I always saw my role at Sweat very much around the kind of technical legal assistance, about supporting the cause. But the aim was also always for sex workers to lead the struggle and to basically kind of work towards creating and achieving the change that is necessary themselves. So yes, this labor law guide was about giving sex workers information that is accessible to everybody. It's not about using lots of legal jargon, talking about the law and sex work, specifically in the area of labor law, but about saying, these are your labor law rights. And the point is that, so this whole idea of the term sex work, we know that traditionally, and even in terms of our law today in South Africa, the term prostitute or prostitution is used. And those terms are actually very derogatory. It attaches a lot of stigma and shame to sex workers. And this term sex work, or these terms sex work or sex worker, it's part of this advocacy for decrim in many ways. It's about saying that sex work is a form of work. It's a form of labor, like any other form of work or labor in all the different areas of work that we engage in as South Africans. It's about recognizing that sex work is a form of work. And as part of that, there was a judgment, which was the Kiley judgment. And this Judge Dennis Davis handed down this judgment. And the judgment did clarify sex workers' rights in some respects. It didn't decriminalize sex work. It didn't specifically in terms of labor law say that these are all your rights and you have the same rights as everybody else. Yes, it does talk about the right to fair labor practices, which is a right that already exists in the Constitution. And in a way, it confirms that sex workers have this right. And that can be determined in a very broad way, not only specifically as it would be listed in labor law legislation of what an unfair labor practice would be, but broader than that. So anything relating to no unfair treatment in any way, for example, any abusive or exploitative working conditions, which Judge Davis specifically talks about in his judgment as well, about the fact that sex workers are vulnerable to marginalization, are marginalized and vulnerable to exploitative working conditions. So whilst the judgment does that, on the other hand, it still doesn't give sex workers the right, for example, to join or form a trade union and participate in its activity. So the law in terms of labor law is very, very touch and go. It's not always very clear. And in fact, sex workers' labor rights need to be further developed, and we need to take more cases to court. So there was a long history before that final judgment. The matter went to the CCMA, it went to the Labour Court, and then ended up in the Labour Appeal Court. But the point is that even though we even have this judgment, it's not quite clear what people's rights are, what sex workers' rights are in particular, not the general population. The law's clear on that. Remember, our Constitution says that you have the right to a trade, occupation, or profession, but in that same provision, it also says that that trade, profession, or occupation can also be regulated by law. So the criminalization of sex work is the way in which the state regulates sex work. That's how the whole, what the setup is in terms of sex work and the law in South Africa, how it is governed. So, labor law, all the different areas become applicable when we talk about criminalization. The point is that the impact of criminalization is that sex workers are not likely to speak out about exploitative working conditions. Kylie was an exception. Because sex workers are criminalized, they fear being able to be identified by the public, by the communities, by their family members. You'll be surprised, sex workers are sometimes supporting their families financially, and their families don't know how they make money, how they support them, because of the shame and the stigma attached to sex work once again. So sex workers are not likely to ever speak out about human rights violations, be it even in terms of criminal law, to talk out against, for example, violence or any other sort of crime that they may be subjected to, because they fear going to the police station, they fear retaliation or profiling, or they fear exposing themselves as sex workers, and that means that they can then be targeted by the police. And then consistently, as we know, police harassment of sex workers is a real issue as well. There is lots of evidence around this. And what happens is that sex workers are then targeted and constantly then have to engage with the criminal justice system. I mean, in a legal context in which what sex workers do is criminalized. It's never about the person is not actually criminalized. What the person does is criminalized. But the point is that indirectly you as the person become criminalized as well. So the kind of targeting and profiling and harassment, once sex workers speak out about any legal issue, expose it, they are become exposed. And it is unsafe to do so. So there are exceptions where some sex workers would speak out and would, seek actual legal recourse for a rights violation. And remember, something relating to labour law could be a human rights violation as well. But the point is, this labour law guide is one of a few. There's many different guides out there, but it's this one I was involved with on labour law, and then there was also one around lockdown and sex workers' rights or understanding criminal procedures and that type of thing. But the point is, it's all about being able to enable sex workers to understand the law themselves and to empower themselves in order to kind of stand up for their own rights or defend themselves in a way. Because the context in which sex workers are operating is a very dangerous context. So criminalization, in fact, also pushes sex workers to the margins of society and the shadows of society. So when a sex worker, like I said earlier, is raped, the chances of her or him speaking out about it or reporting it is very slim. And the people who are committing or perpetrating the violence against sex workers are aware of this. Also, there's a real issue of losing clients, for example, if it's client violence against a sex worker. So there's just so much vulnerability under the criminalization of sex work. And criminalization, well, sex workers are still meant to have all of the rights in the Constitution. The reality is that those rights cannot be enforced as long as sex work is criminalized in South Africa. So recently there was a bill that was issued by the Department of Justice, the minister, and this bill aimed to decriminalize sex work, but has since now been retracted because of the response to the bill on many levels. So it's also important to understand that there are various models for sex work. We currently have full criminalization, and this entails that everything relating to sex work is criminalized. The selling of sexual services, the buying of sexual services, living off the proceeds of sex work, running a brothel, managing a brothel, the full, everything relating to sex work is criminalized. But there are other models like partial criminalization, which is known as the Swedish model or the Nordic model, which is used in Nordic countries. What's considered this Catherine McKinnon approach, where it is about criminalizing only certain aspects. And in that case, particularly, it's about criminalizing the buying of sexual services, so not what the sex worker does. There's also legalization, which is not at all what decriminalization actually is. So decriminalization or decrim aims at putting sex workers in the same position as all other workers would be in, essentially. There could be certain other aspects that could resemble, for example, there's not a fixed way in which it could be done, but it could resemble legalization or regulation. So, when you think of the red light district, for example, that is a legalization or regulated model. where there's compulsory HIV testing for sex workers, specific zones or areas where sex workers can work, and so on. So regulation is where there will be possibly a very specific statute or legislation or set of rules that apply to sex workers. So with Decrim, the aim when advocating for it, or my advocacy or understanding, is about having sex workers treated like all other workers in South Africa, which means what they do is not criminalized at all, which would then improve the way they can access justice services or the criminal justice system in terms of reporting criminal offences committed against them and reporting human rights violations, without attaching this criminality to the conduct. So we could, however, one day end up, if the legal model, which is full criminalization, if there's law reform or a process where the law changes, we could end up with something that may not be one of those specific models I explained now, but it could be a quasi-model. You see, the lecturing me is talking about a module. But there could be a quasi-model of decrim with certain aspects of legalization. Maybe we end up with legalization. The point is that process, in terms of, the next process would have been that a bill is introduced to Parliament by Justice. And that's not going to be happening now. So there has also been, we know, the Jordan case, which was decided in the early 2000s, where the Constitutional Court said, no, the criminalization of sex work is constitutional. Because the aim, part of what the applicants were arguing was that it's unconstitutional because it violates a range of the rights that were applicable in the interim constitution at the time. That time as well, there was a right to economic activity, the right to privacy was questioned, the right to equality in terms of gender, etc., etc. So that judgment is the current law and the current position of the Constitutional Court. And of course, that judgment has been heavily critiqued. It's also important to know that the judges was very close in terms of a 50-50 split. There was a kind of a swaying vote, in a sense, if you can call it that. So that is our current law. Sex work is fully criminalized. I think that the advocacy that's being conducted by organizations such as SWET and other organizations and coalitions that now exist with a range of different civil society organizations and individuals, and then also regional and international institutions, are supporting Decrim, because the evidence is not only, we have to look at other countries like New Zealand and certain parts of Australia and how Decrim has worked there. Of course, the context is different, especially economically and that kind of thing, and with our very recent history of apartheid. But the point is that we can only turn to that and see how it could possibly work for South Africa. So my argument is only about the law and only about human rights. I don't engage in, for me, the kind of moral, social arguments. It's not my area of work. And for me, it's strictly about human rights. And I think that the only way that sex workers' human rights can be protected, advanced, promoted, and fulfilled is going to be if sex work is not criminalized. For me, Decrim would be the best legal model based on my own research on looking at, for example, in New Zealand, where sex workers' relations with police officers improved. They were more open to reporting violence or providing information about, for example, trafficking of others, human trafficking, etc. So an openness which promotes a much healthier relationship between sex workers and the police. At the end of the day, the police is meant to protect vulnerable groups, and sex workers are a vulnerable group. Instead, we know from the research that police officers themselves are perpetrating violence against sex workers. High levels of police brutality. Also, police corruption is a very big issue around how police officers bribe sex workers. A range of police harassment is a real issue as well. So in terms of bribery, it would be about saying, so I won't arrest you if you provide me with a free sexual service. Alternatively, if you give me money or buy me an item of sorts. It could be something as small as a cool drink it could range to a couple of thousand rands if a client is found with a sex worker, for example. So and often, sometimes it's not only police corruption, it's accompanied by police brutality, and so forth. So the point is that the very people who are meant to be protecting vulnerable groups, and particularly sex workers, a group that's comprised primarily of women, the majority of sex workers are women in South Africa, we know, and it's also difficult. We have a size estimation study from, I think, 2000 and what was it? Maybe 2013? I can't remember the exact date, but the point is it's a bit outdated. But it's also difficult to estimate because sex workers, what they do is criminalize. So it's going to be difficult to, get information from sex workers to be, it's an estimate, but we need a new study again. There needs to be a study of that kind so that we know. But we do know majority of sex workers are women. My engagement with sex workers have mainly been with women, or any work I've done have been primarily with women. So the point is that there's a serious gender issue when it comes to criminalization. In South Africa, as we know, women are already highly susceptible, vulnerable to violence and other forms of discrimination, other forms of exclusion. And now, when you have sex workers, women who are sex workers, it just makes them really acutely vulnerable. And there's this compounded impact of this intersectional discrimination because they're sex workers, they're women, they're black, they're poor, etc. It all comes together, and sex workers are so highly vulnerable to oppression in all forms.
I agree with you, especially when it comes to the police and the role that the police are playing, but also that criminalization harshly affect women in most incidences.
And what I'd like to add to that is that we have learned about the impact of criminalization. So essentially in apartheid, essentially black people were criminalized. That was part of it, the kind of control and the exclusion. And in the same way, we've learned from the impact of criminalization on LGBTQI+, particularly, the homosexual, lots of work or how the law developed in terms of discrimination against homosexuals. And we've learned the impact that had as well. So it's not as if on any marginalized groups, which obviously in the case of black people can be a majority oppressed by a minority, as we had in South Africa, which is quite unique. But the point is we've learned from that. So we need to take those lessons that we've learned. And looking at sex work now, I appeal to people to look at it from a criminal justice and a human rights lens, because some of the arguments become watered down, or the decrim argument is attacked from a feminist perspective sometimes, saying that sex work is inherently oppressive, and also that the buyers of the sexual service should be criminalized. The point is that will still place sex workers in a position of being criminalized if the buyers are still criminalized. There's then almost an added worry about the kind of impact of what could happen when a client is caught, because it's very difficult to prosecute people under the current provisions that criminalize sex work in the 2007 Criminal Law Sexual Offences and Related Matters Amendment Act, because essentially the police needs to catch somebody in the act. Essentially. It's very difficult to do that. So what has happened is that you'll find that there's not many prosecutions under those provisions. But for example, in the Western Cape, the bylaws are used, which is local level laws, are used against sex workers to police sex workers, to issue them with notices and fines without even proper due process of them appearing or being given an opportunity to remedy the problematic conduct, as they call it. So bylaws are used to enforce criminalization in many ways as well. So it's also about kind of questioning the usefulness of the current laws and the practicalities of it. And if it's not being used in court, what does that really mean? And it's an important legal point, because if the law is not enforced at all, why do we still have laws that criminalize sex work? So yes, there's lots of different arguments for and against decrim and sex work generally, but for me, the main point is that as long as sex work continues to be criminalized, we are basically, the state is facilitating, directly and indirectly, directly too actually, the perpetration of human rights violations against sex workers and this acute vulnerability to violence and to so many other forms of oppression and discrimination.
Let's look to the future, 100 years from now. So, as you would know, this year's 100 years we celebrate of women in law in South Africa. So, what are your reflections of the state of the legal profession, especially when it comes to women, will it be better in the next 100 years?
So I think that, and we actually had this discussion at the seminar we had with Prof. Levak, and she made this point as well. There has been gains, and of course there have been gains. It's only 100 years that women are working in law, able to be lawyers. It's actually not a very long time, and we can expect challenges, but there has been progress for sure. So many years ago, consulted on a project after I'd worked at an organization where I worked on it that involved gender transformation in the judiciary and then also the legal profession. And we met with several women who worked as magistrates, for example, and spoke to them about their experiences. And a lot of what came out, we learned a lot in understanding that it's not only in, for example, the judiciary or magistracy, it's also about from when we look at the statistics that were then issued by the then Law Society, it's now the Legal Practice Council, we could see that there were some of the very low levels, or very slow, let me say this, the pace of gender transformation in the judiciary and the profession was very, very slow. And I remember that something like the highest level of, or highest percentage of women represented in the judiciary was 30%, which was the highest in the history of South Africa. And as part of that project, we lodged a complaint with the Commission for Gender Equality to look into the slow pace of gender transformation. And they issued a report and acknowledging that there were issues with the slow pace and were putting in efforts in working with the state to improve the representation of women. But like I've said before, it's not only about how many women are in the judiciary. It's not only about how many women work as attorneys and advocates, or now as we call it, the all-encompassing term is a legal practitioner with our Legal Practice Act. That's the new terminology. But the point is, it's not just about the numbers. It's more than that. It doesn't mean that we have gender equality when 50% of the judiciary is comprised of women. It's not the reality. Not all of the women on the bench, even if there was 50% representation, would necessarily be committed to advancing women's rights and improving women's realities. You may find that there's some maybe men who may be more progressive around that. So I'm kind of talking about a mix of issues or mix of things. But also, if you look at the number of women who end up practicing as legal practitioners, very low in comparison to that of men. If we look at the type of work that is given to women, sometimes work that won't develop women in the same way that men are developed, because men have traditionally kind of been trusted with the hard law more. And there are exceptions. I'm not saying that this is what's happening everywhere across the board, but I can also speak about this from personal experience, that certain areas of the law, the softer areas of the law, are seen to be more appropriate for women. And this means that you're not given the kind of opportunity in the same way to develop and grow. And, for example, become ripe for appointment to the bench. Those experiences really matter. When women choose to have children, how they fall off the ladder and aren't able to progress to, for example, becoming directors or seniors in law firms. Let's not even talk about the Bar Council. The bar has traditionally been known and continues to be in many ways an old boys club where work and people work together because they know each other or because they are similarly situated or located or look similar to each other. We understand unconscious bias when it comes to race, gender, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity. It's something that exists. We navigate towards people and will give people opportunities when they look similar to us. Of course, there are people who make concerted efforts and understand history and understand how there's been a lack of opportunities for certain groups or categories of people, such as women, not to mention black women in particular. So, it's about looking at all of these factors and understanding historically women's position in law. Yes, there's been developments. I mean, we've had the Constitutional Court handing down very progressive judgments around women, starting with Kern, Carmichael around violence and the duty to protect, or the state's duties to women, for example, the prosecution, the police, etc. Those judgments exist. There's been progressive developments in law towards women's issues. Women are better represented in the judiciary, in the magistracy, and also there's been affirmative action requirements that have, entailed that more women need to be appointed in particular types of roles. But it's a mix of things. We also know that when we look at affirmative action numbers, we may find more black women working in and I like to call it professional administration, or some of what's considered lower levels of support roles than, the decision-making roles. And even in decision-making roles, how do we... Patriarchy is prevalent in society broadly, but then also in terms of all different sorts of institutions and structures in society, from the family to the workplace. And in workplaces and even in government, even in state institutions, where how is it always possible for women to negotiate power in terms of decision-making when there's a majority of men at the table still? Or not just that, generally, even if there's more women, because power dynamics, like we spoke about, a minority of people can also, we know this, we've learned this from our history, control and make decisions. So it's a complex thing. Again, I don't have particular answers for it. I'm saying these are my ideas and understanding of the issues. Women's realities, and I mean this includes women lawyers, have definitely improved. It's definitely improved. There's a greater, because... So prior to us having a constitution, a lot of the fight or the struggle for liberation was very much around race. And whilst there was talk of gender and some work around gender, I believe that the focus on gender deepened after the constitution. And this is where we also saw the laws being developed in line with the constitution. And I do think, yes, the law plays a role in what happens in society and how people think. This is why I believe that if sex work is decriminalized, the fact that sex work is criminalized is also almost a justification for the oppression of sex workers or unfair discrimination against sex workers, because it says, but this is against the law, and this is the level at which members of society identify with the law. You're doing something wrong, for example, a famous incident that happened in Kenilworth where a white man assaulted a woman who he believed to be a sex worker. And he said that I assaulted her, black woman, who was actually a domestic worker, because she was a sex worker. And he said this openly. It was all over the media. It's a Tim Osborne case. And the matter was never finalized in court. So there was never a conviction for assault, because the person, the complainant, didn't go forward with the case because of a range of factors in terms of, sitting on a stand, and she's the main state witness, and she was not able to follow through with the process. But the point is, I'm trying to illustrate the extent of the stigma. And I think that if sex work is not considered a crime in South African law, there is, over time, and with a lot of advocacy and communications and media, you will find that slowly there will be shifts developing in how people think about it. I'm not talking about, I know you don't just change behavior overnight, but I think the law plays an initial role in setting a foundation for behavior change and attitudinal changes somewhere along the way.
So my question still is, will it be better in the next 100 years?
I'm sure that there will be developments, but we also need for women lawyers. It will certainly, because, even movements such as Fees Must Fall played a critical role in modern times in 2015 and beyond, to start talking about things like patriarchy, decolonial ways of thinking, or what we were taught through that. So I think, yes, there's more of a woke culture amongst young people as well. And I think that makes a difference in how young people, and young women in particular, young lawyers, occupy space, claim space, and how there may be a greater willingness to fight the system. And it's very difficult, because fighting a system is a tiring process which often alienates you and leaves you on your own, which eventually weakens you, because this is how it works with any form of structural and institutional oppression and exclusion of what that does, what those who want to make the changes experience. So support structures amongst women is very, very important. Women at different levels or different of their career, different time periods or career, are able to support other women. It's critical, but also this notion of support also again buys into this kind of constant care requirement for women, whilst men are able to just get on with it and develop their careers while they have wives and supportive partners often. And I'm not saying this is the case. Relationships have changed. There have been shifts in all forms of relationships, not only in the home or marriages and relationships, but in the workplace too. There are shifts, but I don't think that they've necessarily been sufficient enough to say that we are equal to men because we're not treated equally. We wouldn't experience these high levels of gender-based violence if we were equal, for example. We'd have, that wouldn't be the case. So I think that, yes, there have been positive developments. I think that there are going to be more developments in the future. But I also want to talk about how, kind of policies and approaches and the laws that change in other countries who are more, I don't like using the language of first and third world countries, but more developed countries who, have greater power in terms of the world generally, such as the USA, how the recent judgments also may affect the decisions made, the impact it has. For example, overturning this Roe versus Wade judgment, which last year, which gave women the right to have sexual reproductive, to have terminations of pregnancy. So a real step back or a regression in many ways in terms of women's sexual reproductive health and rights. So while that happens in the US, and it's not happening here exactly, there is an impact that those laws have throughout the world, in fact, or the thinking behind it, which is actually, it's a serious regression. It's a serious going back to limiting women's rights in many ways. So we need to also be aware of the kind of international perspective or the international climate and how that impacts on us here. Even the recent affirmative action case relating to students in academia in the USA also. What does that mean? Affirmative action is still such a necessary step to take, even in the context of the USA. We've learned so much about Black Lives Matter. We know what's happening in the USA, how Black people's lives are at risk constantly. Their lives are at risk because they are Black. So we understand the deep racism. And when it comes to Black women, a whole nother layer of racism, or how it's deepened when it comes to women. So there's just a range of these factors, and it all plays a role in terms of our approaches. I think in South Africa, our constitution would be very difficult to change. But the point is, there's also there's also a disconnect between our constitution and the lived realities. And again, I say, there obviously have been improvements, but it's a process. It's not something that's going to change overnight.
All right, so let's talk about the state of women in South Africa. So next year, 30 years of democracy in South Africa. As a woman in South Africa, what are your reflections on our state? Will it last another 30 years?
I'm hoping that our GBV statistics decrease in the next 30 years. Not just that, other forms of inequality that women experience from in the workplace to, I do think that progress will be made. I think that times are changing. I think that people are thinking differently. But I also think that it's not across the board, and perhaps not amongst the majority of people who are living in conditions where basic needs or necessities, they don't have the basic necessities and are struggling to survive. I'm not saying that we need to be so careful about how we talk about this, but the point is, when your basic economic needs are not being met, how are issues of equality, how does that become as important to engage in a process of change? And also sometimes in communities, there's a deep sense of cultural and religious convictions which don't necessarily support. Women still need to know their place in many ways, is what I'm saying. And becoming a lawyer is certainly not something that would be common. Although I'm not saying that women are not doing it. They are. But those sometimes, I think, can also be seen as exceptions. Most people don't get most poor people don't have access to education or basic education or complete matric even today. Matric level, it's improving, but these are the realities. So I really think, again, how do we marry? And it's something I need to think about more, the socioeconomic issues with these kind of, civil and political rights, the basic rights to equality, to privacy, to making decisions regarding your reproductivity, etc. It's a very, very difficult situation, and I think there are definite links between people's socioeconomic conditions and the realities of women in particular in terms of violence being used against women to control them, or like I've spoken about earlier already, about how power is used against people who are considered weaker or just people who are vulnerable. So power and control through the use of violence in those ways. So I think there have been improvements for sure. There's definitely been developments. Women do have more rights for sure. But on the other hand, we also saw increasing levels of violence against women in COVID, for example. We know that there are still women who are not being paid the same salaries as men who perform the same roles that they do, or women who are excluded from opportunities to develop themselves or their careers simply because they are women, because they have children. So, there's definitely an improvement, but I still think there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
So, final question: looking back on your career that is dominated by men, what message do you have for a young woman who want to enter the legal profession?
You've got to be brave and you've got to be willing to work hard. I think that working hard, and unfortunately, I hate saying this to the extent that often women and black people need to work even harder than their white counterparts, particularly white males, simply because we don't have or not given, we don't have the benefit of assumed legitimacy and capabilities that white men have. And in relation to women of color and black women that white women are assumed to have as well. So there are layers and interesting interrelationships, within the hierarchy. And the point is that the merit gives us a good kind of way of negotiating our rights, or not negotiating it, enforcing our rights, or demanding that we are given the same equal treatment or entitlements or opportunities as others who we do not look like and who have different assumptions about their abilities than we do. So it's a very difficult thing. The point is that we do need to be brave, and it's important that we build communities and support systems for ourselves, and so that we are able to stand up and ensure that what we are entitled to is given to us in the ways that it's been given to other groupings before. Not based on them being better at doing anything necessarily, or not based not on the assumption that they make better lawyers, for example, because that's certainly not the case. But really just about, we need a support system. It can be a very lonely experience. But look, more and more lawyers are women, but like I say, many of them fall out and don't go to practice or eventually move up to the extent of going to the bench. So it's about trying to gain as much experiences, but also being willing to fight for your rights. And fighting for your rights, like I said earlier, can become a very alienating experience. So it is useful to have groups of people with us, because in anything we do, if we want change, the bigger the numbers of people that support our cause, the more convincing we become. We then demand people to listen to us. And we must also be careful. Not all women are interested in women's rights. Not all women are feminists, and there are different types of feminists who support different types of feminisms. And, we mustn't make that assumption either. But if there's a common interest, we need to get that support. And let's also not be fooled that there may be men. There are exceptions, and men who may support us in better ways than some women, who may be committed to human rights, committed to women's rights, to advancing women's rights.
Cherith, thank you very much for this conversation. And I am positive that a lot of women, not just women, men, will have a different way at looking some of the burning issues that we were talking today about. And I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that there is another 30 years and there is another 100 years. So thank you for taking the time and joining us on this podcast.
Thank you for an interesting discussion. I've got a lot to think about, and there's always so much to think about. There are no clear-cut answers. So thank you.